Welcome Commanders, Spartan Vanguard only here, trying to do a quick video on paint consistency and how to get the best out of it. So it's a bit late at the moment, so I've got the light on and hopefully this is going to be good enough. Here I am working on a UNSC Marathon Cruiser, so it's a supported variant, and I will try and get to that soon, putting a video up. If not, there's the Bitsbox tutorial that's fantastic, and I've got a great little YouTube video on doing it nice and quickly. In the background here I've got some Lord of the Rings miniatures from various states from other people. So here's some Easterlings I'm working on. I buy these models second hand because it just costs too much from Games Workshop Direct, but I'm trying to demonstrate some painting principles here, and I haven't got any second hand Spartan stuff, so I don't really want to damage my good stuff by demonstrating some stuff. This model here is in a bad state, so I'm trying to get that to focus. It is not in a good way. As you can see by the plume on the left, it actually is supposed to have little indents in between each of these feathers, but the paint has been placed on so thickly that the detail is all but obscured. Like, you can barely see it. If I twist it just right, you might be able to see some of it. But this is an example of paint being applied far too thickly, like to the point where you really want to scrap that. This model is borderline unsalvageable, even with stripping because of the amount of glue on him. Here, conversely, we have a model that has been painted too thinly, so that the painting on this, I don't believe they've undercoated it. As you can see, the grey plastic underneath, which means that there's not as much surface for it. So you don't have to prime your models, but priming is a way of increasing the surface area of your figures. So essentially it's a rough texture that means that it's easier for future paint to bind on. What this person's done is, as they've painted it, they've used orange and a light brown, which is like a pseudo-orange, half brown, half orange. And orange and yellow are notoriously liquid paints, so they're just naturally very, very wet paints. And they've tried to apply it in one coat nice and thick, and it's run, like you can see where it's run onto the figure, it's spilled over onto his arm, out here. And in the end, you can still see the grey through it. So even working with primer and stuff like that, you do want to take your time with oranges and yellows in particular. They're just very, very dangerous colours. Here we have an example of a very, very cruel person who did not like Easterlings, and the fact that they are Easterling spearmen, no less, is even more saddening, because they're just very valuable in the box. You don't get many of them, and there's supposed to be lots of them. Here we've got someone who has painted what looks like an enamel paint, judging by the high gloss texture, over a black base coat, and they've tried to do it in one coat, just flat out put it all over it. We've got actually a bit of both examples here. So if you look at the eyes, and if you look at here, you can see that it's run into the crevices, but he's put so much on that it's also obscuring all the detail. So it's an example of both too watery and too thick. So kudos to him. And then on top of that, because you can see the red in parts shining through, they've gone and sprayed them black. So these were actually given, they're just part of a salvage lot that I've got. But yeah, going to take a lot of work to get that back. And it might not even happen, even with proper stripping. Now we're going to look at paints. So I use Vallejo and some Games Workshop stuff. I don't particularly advise getting the Games Workshop stuff, unless it's the washes and things like that. In that case they're quite good, but Vallejo is where I think it's really at. You can see here that this is the paint pigment colour, and this is not the paint pigment colour, but that's actually a liquid. Can't really see it in this light. If it was daylight you would, but that is liquid at the top. So paint is essentially a pigment in a suspension. And so in this case, the pigment has separated, so it's fallen out, because I don't use this colour particularly often. It's fallen out and gone down, and so you always need to shake your paint pots before every use, even between things. So I'm just going to do that here. You want to shake it, and you also want to give it a good solid bang. So just like a solid bang, because you want to dislodge that pigment up the top and really have to mix it through. So just bang, and really endear yourself to the neighbours. Like a solid one. You don't want to bang it, but break it, but see how the colour's starting to get through. I still would not trust that. When that comes out, that's going to be far too watery at this top part. Now Now this is not a more formalized video. This one I'm doing in response to a particular request on how to thin paints and what consistency should be done. So I'm going to try and get stuck into that. Essentially when you're applying the paint, you want it to do a certain role. So if you're doing a wash, you're going to want a high liquid to paint ratio. You can get pre-made washes and that's fine because that does, you know, what you're after. But you can also make your own just by watering down pigments and things like that. Some paints come out absolutely fine to use straight from the bottle. We've got this this brown here from Vallejo again, and I find that this one, because I use it all the time, it's pretty well shaken up. And on top of that, it's just a good colour. Like even when I first got it, some of the other ones were giving trouble because I got them all at the same time. But this one, straight from the pot, I can put it down and have it ready to go. So I'll do that. This is a wet palette that I'm working on at the moment. My other video covers what that is. Essentially it's a semi-porous material. So I've got baking paper on top, non-wax. And if you look at my Painting Halo Miniatures 101 before you start, it covers what that is. Now we've got this paint. I always dip my paintbrush in a bit of water, give it a bit of swirl in that, just to try and get the bristles all together, so you want to make sure that they're cohesive. Now I have not applied any water to this, aside from the tiny bit that's in the brush. That doesn't count as watering it down. You pick up the paint, okay, and we'll grab one of these guys I'm working on off to the side. Here, he'll do. And we put that onto his feet there. It's not the clearest light. I'll try and get this light in a bit closer. Okay. So you put it onto his feet. And this brown is okay to do this with. Like, it really doesn't matter so much because it comes out quite well. I would water it down normally, just a little tiny bit. But this brown is particularly good. So as I'm applying the paint strokes, you can see there, the paint's coming off, it's gliding, it's not really sticking. That's not particularly raised. It's a bit difficult to describe. It's sort of like PVA. So not as thick as that, but as in a watered down PVA, just slightly. If you've got a 1:1 PVA ratio, that's sort of what you're looking for here, where it sticks and it doesn't roll everywhere like water or an ink would, but you also don't want it to stick up and to stay there. So that's fine for him. I'll go back to the rest of him later. Doesn't really matter for him. But that's working with a nice easy paint. Other times, if you find the paint's too thick, you can put water down. So I like to just get a brush, scoop it on, and you just put an actual physical blob of water down right there. So now I can pick up my paint and put it there in its third location, scoop some water, mix it in, and you'll see that now it's a lot runnier and it's doing that pooling effect. That's actually probably a little too watery for what I'm after, but I am trying to demonstrate how these work. So if you have paint that's too watery, it'll end up like this. This is just a coffee lid that I use for mixing up dry paints, so something I'm going to dry brush or things like that. And here's an example of what happens if you have a paint that's too wet. Let's just pretend I've applied that to my model, and it was actually applied in an even coat, so it was just put down. And you'll notice that it's sticking to the corners. That's because the corners here, corners, but the rim I should say, or the edge, has a greater surface area because it's not to paint. So this has got paint surrounding it, whereas these outside parts have less paint because, you know, they're exposed to this outer bit here, which means that they're naturally going to dry faster. Because they're drier, they'll draw out the moisture from their center part, and you'll end up with a deposit of pigment on the perimeter. So this is an example of a paint that was applied too wet. So if I had that on one of my ships, on one of my panels, so like my marathon cruiser, you'll wind up with that. In fact, I actually did that in this marathon here, so I wasn't too happy with the transition I got. So on this particular segment here, I applied that, and there's a very thick streak there, and the transition just is not so smooth, and that's because I used a paint that was too watery. So I should have used less pigment and less paint, but change that ratio up. Other paints you've got to be really careful with, like this white comes out. I don't know what it is about this white, but it's killed 2 of my CCSs. I was trying to convert it into a Vallejo air paint, so that's a bit, on me, so that's my bad. But it comes out in just the gluggiest of states. So if you look at that, that is just, and that's as little as I can get out because it comes out in a big lump. You can see right there that that's not going to be appropriate to use for pretty much anything. Over here, I've got the same white. I've just watered it down a little bit, mixed it through, and you can still see it's very, very gluggy. But the more water I add to this, the smoother it gets. But it gets to the point where now it's actually too watery. See how I put it down and it soaks up like that? That means that it's too watery. So you've got these 2 extremes. You want it to behave like this brown. So I put it down, it soaks up. I put this one down, and it's big, it's gluggy, it's disgusting. You're going to end up with bumps all over your model. Whereas this brown, take this, hopefully it works, should get a relatively good sight. Now it's sort of sucking up because again this is a semi-porous pad, so it's got the kitchen paper on top and it's designed to provide that moisture. But were I to apply this to the figure, it would run a bit into the crevices. It's probably a bit wet now, but hopefully that does show the kind of consistency that you're looking for. If not, I'm going to try and just find a figure, one that doesn't matter too much. Problem is I've only got like the ones I was working on nearby. Here we are, bit of a conversion I was doing ages ago. So this paint here, watered down one, that's too thin, you can see through it. I could use this in multiple coats, but most people try and get it done in one. That's another trick, is don't go for one coat. If you're struggling to get the coverage, and for instance you can see the little black bits because it's quite a textured base, and not hugely, like intentionally so, but it's got a bit of grit on it. Whereas this brown should go and give a nice coat on the first one. And that's not too thick. I'm not seeing any significant lumps on that. So I'm happy to leave that like that. If anything, it's probably closer to the too watery at this stage. And here we've got the pure paint, the pure white, where it's going on like that. And there are significant lumps at this top part because I've front loaded the brush. Because it's all dry and stuck on, it's basically gone, ooh, very unpleasant. And the paint behaves differently as I go to spread it. So that's another thing that you want to look at is I'll put this paint on. So this is pure white with the big glugs. And as I go to spread it, it's a bit difficult. It's not end of the world, but that's because I've applied water through this wet palette. If it was on top of that coffee lid, I guarantee it would not be spreading this easily. But as you can see, it's still quite thick. We'll try with the brown now. And really, when you're painting, it's to achieve an effect. So I want this to spread nice and easily, but I also want to give it decent coverage. Like I don't want to do 200 coats if I can avoid it. But if I think it'll add to the figure, or I'm trying to do a nice transition. But if you're base coating, this brown is a really good coat. So see how it's going on? It's covering it. I can't see the black through it. It's a good base coat. Whereas this white, I'd have to go over it, then over it, then over it, then over it again. This one here started off good, and now it's already starting to clump up in certain parts. So you can see it's thicker in some parts, not in others. It's running. It's just not so great. It's because I haven't mixed that white enough. So that is an example of a nicely spreading paint right there. The succinct version, so the too long, didn't read section of this, is you want the paint to go on and stay where you put it. So it's no good me having a paint that I put it all up here and then it pulls up and pulls back to itself. I'm going to spend half the time fighting this paint going, oh my gosh, spreading, 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 and it's not going to work. Equally, I don't want a big lump like that, where I can see actual physical lumps and it's just sticking up and casting its own shadows. It's not worth it to get that paint in one go. Grey paints, which apparently you'll be using for your UNSC marathon cruises, are quite nice in general, so you won't usually have this problem. At least with the Vallejo greys I've got, they're fantastic. You can spread out your paint, so you can glub it on thickly if you want and then do this, but even that, you're going to dry. And in particular, if I let this dry like that without spreading out my paint and then wanted a smooth transition over it, you would have a discernible bump in this segment here. Whereas this brown, you would not. I would be able to go over that with any other colour and the transition would be relatively seamless. So that's it. So it's just balancing those two opposite things. So too watery, too thin, but also tailor it to what you want. If you want to get a firm base coat, leave it a bit to the thick side. If you want to do multiple thin coats, like a transition or something like that, do lots of thin ones. Or if you want to use it as a wash, lots of thin coats. That's your general premise. And tailor it to the paints. Do not be, oh, okay, I'll do a 1-to-1 ratio, so 1 part water, 1 part paint, because you're asking for trouble. Different paints behave differently. You saw how that white came out. It was disgusting. But equally, you saw how the brown came out. It was fantastic. It was pretty much good to go right from the start. But if we were trying to get a red or a yellow or an orange, those colours tend to be quite difficult. So it's just mixing those up, keeping that in mind, and testing what works and what fits where. Okay. All the best. Oni out.